presentation. I would also like to pick up the argument of university organization. And when Chicky asked me to give a presentation, I made a couple of proposals, and he said, okay, maybe you should talk about this kind of intended and unintended reform consequences, because there's a whole issue about reforming university organization is fraught with paradoxes. And I would like to, over the next, let's say, 15 minutes, I would like to highlight a few of them with regards to the national system I come from, that is Germany, but I think the argument is much broader and not bound to a specific national system. The basis of the presentation, it's not the first time here that we have a book as a basis of a presentation. It's a book that came out this year, authored by Otto Hüther and me, and it's a comprehensive description and analysis of reforms and developments in the German system, from, let's say, rather broad quantitative structural configuration, governance and organizational structures, concrete actors like students and academics, management, equality of opportunity. A lot of people were very helpful for shaping this book. I would like to mention two. First, Gerhard Kasper, former Stanford president. He wrote the foreword, and I'm kind of proud of it. He's German, but he spent basically his whole academic career in the US, in Chicago and Stanford, and he wrote the foreword to this book. And Peter Maaßen was also very helpful, because it appeared in a series edited by him, and he gave us a lot of very, very helpful comments. And the main argument of the presentation is, and we're talking about unintended effects, and the main argument of the presentation is also an unintended effect of the analysis of different reform areas. So when we talk about paradoxes of reforms, this is certainly not a paradox. This is more kind of a self-referential reflexive loop. I talk about unintended consequences, and the basis are unintended consequences of a book. And it is an unintended consequence or side product of the analysis of very, very different reform areas in Germany. So if we take a closer look at where... you need to put this a bit up because it's hard to hear you in the back. Okay. So if we take a closer look at what reform areas or areas in higher education we're talking about, you can think about research, teaching, funding structures, personal structures, and organizational structures. And all these areas were shaped heavily, let's say, over the last 20 to 25 years by reforms. I don't want to go through it, but the point I would like to make is that they all have an impact on organizational structure. But the interesting thing is that, at least that's the argument I would like to make, is that attempts at deliberately changing organizational structures, that is what you see in the bottom here, were the least effectful ones. So you have a lot of effective organizational reforms without the intention to alter organizational structures, and the least reform effects you have when you focus on deliberately changing organizational structures. Here in Germany, by strengthening the position of presidents and deans and the introduction of university councils. This is, by the way, a trend we can observe in many, many systems worldwide. So my presentation basically is twofold. I will briefly focus on deliberate, intentional attempts to alter organizational structures through reforms. And secondly, I would like to focus on attempts to reform, let's say, the research structure through the Excellence Initiative in Germany, which had a huge impact on organizational structures. So when we talk about what levels of organizational change we talk about, throughout the book, and it's a little bit schematic, but I think it helps a lot. We distinguish between three analytical levels when we talk about change. We talk about discursive change. We talk about changes in formal structures, that is mainly legal structures, but it could also be organizational rules and regulations. And we talk about the practice. And for us, these three levels are distinct. And you should always be very careful what you're talking about when you talk about organizational change. Is it more on the discursive level? Is it at the level of formal structure? Or is it at the level of actual practices? And when we take a look at organizational deliberate changes in the organizational structures of universities, we can apply this kind of threefold scheme nicely. We can see at the discourse, we can see clearly that hierarchy is seen as a new dominant coordination mechanism in university. But this is discursively. At the formal structure, as I said, it's basically about legal structures. In Germany, we have 16 different state laws. We have very different governance models. But we see in most university laws a strengthening of presidents and deans. And we also have an argument also on university council. These positions were strengthened at the formal structure. If we take a look at the practice level, and there are a lot of studies now, they clearly show there are hardly any hierarchical decision in German universities, at least not among professors. Presidents and deans do not use their formal decision-making power. There is an increase of informal negotiation arenas. So it's also a very paradoxical situation. The more formal structures you create, the more informal structures you generate. And professors still have a central role in the decision processes, notwithstanding the idea that deans and presidents are the central decision makers now in German universities. So to sum up this argument, the effects of the reforms that intended to change the decision-making practices in German universities are rather small. And as I said, there's a lot of studies now, PhD studies, habilitations, research projects, that all converge on the point that the decision-making practices have hardly been altered through organizational reforms. I now come to my second example, namely the focus on research excellence. The discourse, again, is we need a stronger differentiation, we need a higher selectivity and competition in the system in order to lead to a few handful world-class research university and world-class research in general. So here the reform is not at the organizational level, but more on the systemic level. You have much less explicit reform intentions concerning organizational structures of universities. Only in one of the three funding lines you have an explicit focus on organizational structures. In the two others, this is not the case. If we take a look at the formal structure, here formal structure means funding structure, not a legal structure. You see a broad funding. We don't focus on 3 or 4 world-class university as was put in the discourse. We have only limited differentiation. Last year we had a funding of 44 universities. This is 1/3 of all German universities. That means the discursive attempt to talk about world-class universities, world-class research, it is very much watered down at the level of formal structure by funding 1/3 of German universities. At the practical level, you have very, very interesting and strong, but also contradictory consequences. You see a strong internal differentiation. That means the idea that through the Excellence Initiative you might create a common organizational identity certainly did not work out, because you have a strong internal differentiation within one organization. You have new veto players among the professoriate, which goes against the governance reforms, where you think that maybe deans and presidents are the key figures in universities. This is certainly not the case. Strong professors, strong university professors are the key and central players, and they were strengthened through the Excellence Initiative. And you see new opportunities and risks for university leadership. So it has strong spillover effects nobody thought about. For example, when the last round was announced 5 weeks ago, one academic senate voted to oust the university president because the university was not very successful. The academic council voted against it. So you have a huge conflict within the university, which nobody anticipated. What are the explanation? And this is still a little bit sketchy, but we would like also to give an explanation why we see these different consequences. You focus on deliberate changes in organizational governance with hardly any effect on the practical side. and you focus on the Excellence Initiative with a focus on research, and you have strong organizational effects. And our argument is it has to do with a different coordination logics, hierarchy versus status competition. And it also ties into what Lars said, and when he used this kind of traditional Burton-Clark triangle. Hierarchy, at least in the German system, is still as an illegitimate logic among professors. So there might be hierarchy within an institute, but among professors, and deans and rectors are professors, it is an illegitimate logic among professors. Deans can never be so strong, or presidents can never be so strong as to exercise their formal decision-making power. What is instead a legitimate logic is status competition. Linda Wettlin has written about it, some others too. Status competition increases in universities, and I think it's a different kind of competition as compared to the competition we are used to. We have a strong history of competition in universities, but typically at the individual level. It's the level of the individual researchers. There's research by Robert K. Merton, Pierre Bourdieu, and others, and historical analysis who show that competition is typically played out at the individual level, but now it is becoming more organizational competition, and organizational competition appears as status competition. Further reflections. This is my last slide. Obviously, but this is kind of a pretty cheap point, I would say. You always have to take into account the strong role of national and organizational specificities. This is a plea for comparative research, both research across different national systems, but what I also find interesting, research among different organizational forms, because you have different kinds of reform attempts also in hospitals, in schools, in the public administration sector. Second point, the long-term consequences of the individual reforms are open. When we talk about the Excellence Initiatives, there was an evaluation a year and a half ago, and they still stated that after, 8 or 9 years, you can hardly say whether you achieved your goal or not, your research-oriented goal, not the organizational goal. And so the long-term consequences of these individual reforms are still open. Third point, I think this is getting more interesting here. I think we can observe an interplay of different changes and reforms, but we still have to model it. And I'm still trying to figure out how to model these different changes and reforms. And I guess we can also see emergent processes. With the term emergence, obviously I refer to the book by Paget and Powell, which I found most inspiring, because emergence is a concept coming from the natural sciences, which plays a strong role in societal dynamics. So what we observed are path dependencies, but these path dependencies might be broken up through kind of emergent processes, as we can see currently in the politics in Europe, where nobody anticipated 2 or 3 years ago that we're in the mess we are now. Last point, incremental changes at the structural level. That is a kind of basic point of our book, of our argument. At the structural level, if you go through all these areas, the changes are rather incremental, less radical, but we can observe a lot of radical changes, but not at the structural level, but rather at the level of ideas, attitudes, perceptions. I think if you focus on ideas, attitudes, perception, the picture might look very, very different when it comes to change. So I think it's more this kind of Red Queen idea of Lewis Carroll, that you see a lot of movement of the individual actors, but which is not visible, let's say, at the structural level. So I think we focus on the structural level, but it might be very, very interesting to focus more strongly on changes of ideas, attitudes, and perceptions. Thank you.